Welcome back, everybody. If we could take our seats, we'll begin the afternoon session. Thank you. It gives me great pleasure to introduce my friend and former colleague in government, Michael E. Levine, who is going to be the thought leader for this afternoon session. I introduced Mike earlier today. He is a former executive of at least 3 different airlines at last count, a professor at Harvard and at Yale and currently at NYU. He was probably the most important guy at the CAB the time he was there, notwithstanding that there was somebody called the chairman. The most important guy was Mike Levine. And as I indicated, he is a genuine author of deregulation of the domestic airline market in the United States. So Mike, if you would please take the podium.
So thank you for the generous introduction, Jeff, and thanks to Peter Harbison for organizing this and inviting me. I think CAPA is doing great work in helping people think about and understand what's going on in an industry which represents perhaps an endless movie of change. We sometimes talk as though we're waiting to get to the right frame so we can stop the movie and now we'll know what it is. But I have bad news for anyone in the audience who's waiting for the movie to stop. The movie will be going on, and if you stop looking, you'll miss the next frame. What I want to talk about in the relatively brief time we have here is how the low-cost airline model has evolved and why it seems to be in many ways beginning to converge with the legacy model, a process that I think will go on but may take a lot of time. I recognize that most of you in the audience are not from the United States, and I will be talking a fair amount about the United States because it, and then Canada and Australia and Europe, simply have had the most experience with deregulated markets. We now have basically 33 years of evidence in the United States, not that much less in Canada, somewhat less in Europe, which is certainly still evolving. The process really is just beginning in Asia. I certainly recognize, to save the first 3 questions, that Asia is different, but we don't know how different. And I think it's very useful to understand what seems to happen because we've seen pretty parallel developments in the US, Canada, Australia, and Europe as time has come on, has moved on, including a moderate amount of convergence between the so-called LCC model and the so-called legacy model. So with that introduction, let me begin with sort of a discussion of very basic airline economics, which many of you know, but which are the foundation in a way for what's going on. The first thing we understand is that aircraft are expensive and that the capital costs of running an airplane and airline service require that the aircraft be used fairly intensely in order to get the unit cost down to acceptable levels. So we are really talking about flying these things an absolute minimum of 10 hours a day. 11 is better, 12 is better than that. Past 12 gets to be very, very difficult and often results in compromises and convenience that we'll talk about. Airline ground costs similarly have this aspect that some of them are fixed. If you have a gate lease, if you have a real presence at an airport, you want to get enough operations off the gate to make it worthwhile to lease it and staff it and so on. If you're at an airport where you're not a significant presence, you can certainly buy or rent gate services, but you lose some control, and that imposes some inconveniences, adds some cost if compared to having one of your own that's sort of fully utilized. Total costs, also many of them have the aspect that at least up to a certain point, up to some minimum point, you need to do more in order to amortize them. This is true of overhead costs, IT costs, marketing costs, all sorts of costs that have the characteristic that you need to expend them at least at some minimum level in a fixed unit that needs to be spread over operations. So to run a truly minimum cost airline, and we're talking about what the ideal LCC in the sky and what its cost would look like, you're talking about 15 or so aircraft in order to get fleet costs to a minimum. That is, pilot training costs you can amortize over enough pilots so that you can staff the airplanes properly, so that you can standardize your procedures and all the rest of it. So 15 aircraft, the way seat unit cost curves go, as most of you know, is they decline pretty rapidly up to about 150 seats, and then much more gradually as the unit gets bigger. So I say 150 plus seats. You need about 12 hours of utilization. You need about an 80% load factor. You can run higher than that, but it gets harder and harder. But even that, if you add it up, turns out to be a lot. It's 21. I did the complicated math. It's 21,800 passenger hours per day per aircraft. Obviously, how many actual passengers there are depends on your stage length. And it means 10 plus departures per gate per day that either you have or someone else has, unless you can persuade, as Ryanair is very talented at doing, persuade an airport to eat a fair number of the costs fixed costs involved in gates. Then you get complaints from the EU and competitors about unfair advantage. On the revenue side, basically, most passengers, when they buy a ticket, trade between price and convenience. They will buy 30 days or 45 days or 60 days in advance, or limit refundability, or take a flight not at their absolute preferred departure hour, or even from their absolute preferred departure airport to their not preferred airport, if you pay them. If you pay by offering them a low enough price. Some passengers have a much higher price for convenience than others. Business passengers will pay for convenience. Many leisure passengers, it appears, will do almost anything to save $1, a euro, or whatever your unit of currency is on a ticket. So the ideal, no compromise, low-cost airline would have high-frequency, full-plane service between uncongested airports that were every passenger's first preferred airport. This is not really possible in the real world. So all real-world airline business models, everyone's, whether they call themselves bare bones or plush or anything in between, trade price for convenience. Either the airline supplies greater convenience at a higher cost, it uses a more congested airport. It holds an aircraft on its gates for an extra 15 or 30 minutes to get a departure time that passengers seem to prefer. It flies to an airport that is convenient or less convenient for passengers, but higher or lower cost for the airline to use. So the airline either supplies greater convenience for more money, or the customer is asked to compromise. We never call it a compromise. We just say, you can fly to Malaga for €1 or whatever, and the customer decides whether whatever goes with that, including all the ancillary revenue, is worth the price. So the hard facts of life, and this is really critical to the evolution of these models. A truly minimum cost, convenient operation is virtually impossible. Takes a lot of passengers to support an airline of minimum efficient size, so a really small LCC is not possible. Of course, you may begin small, and you may have other advantages, including that you're shocking a market with low prices, so customers come to you and you get a lot of revenue. But the fact is that it takes to run an airline with 15 aircraft being used so many hours a day, leaving gates often enough and so on. It takes a lot of daily passengers. This is the brutal fact of life, is that only a very few airport pairs defined by true O&D preference of the passenger, as opposed to what they'll compromise to do to save money, will support frequent turnaround service in a 150-seat aircraft. It's not none, obviously. There are, at one level, you can say many such in the world, tens, possibly even low hundreds. I'm not sure that it's that many. But if you think of all the city pair markets you can have, it's a very small fraction. In the real world, you can come close to a pure convenience model. You can run NetJets. I'm not sure it's an airline, but it's a kind of airline, meaning that the customer doesn't own the plane. Basically, you can call it part ownership, but it's a system in which you make a reservation, and they supply an airplane just when you want it, to go from just where you want it to be to just where you want to go. Very, very expensive. Or you can do something very low cost. You can go from some place you call Munich, which isn't Munich, to some place you call Brussels, that isn't Brussels. And you can say to the passenger, this fare is cheap enough so that even if you want to go from Munich to Brussels, you'll sort of ignore the 100 kilometers at either end that you'll have to supply to this equation. Even there, the inexorable facts of airline life, for example, even for Ryanair, very successful at that game, requires that Charleroi, AKA Brussels, or maybe I should say Brussels, AKA Charleroi, is a focus city, meaning that you have a big enough operation there that you can amortize the ground costs that I was talking about to get departure costs down to a low level. So even a Ryanair, as loudly as Mr. O'Leary proclaims his devotion to minimum cost no matter what, makes compromises in order to provide the lowest possible. But these basic facts have been obscured by history. And this is very deceptive in a way, because as Dave Barger was saying this morning, and as some of the other panelists also suggested, your brain is conditioned by what you know from history. And so what you think is possible or necessary is conditioned by what you've always seen. So regulation distorted supply choices. The government told you where you could fly, whether or not that was exactly what passengers wanted to do, that you had to make certain stops, that you couldn't fly Fifth Freedom routes, for example, or let alone Sixth Freedom routes. It usually defined price choices through either caps or floors, or disallowing certain kinds of fare conditions and so on. It distorted service choices when IATA or the government imposed minimum prices so that airlines competed on service. In the United States, there was a glorious moment after the introduction of jets when airlines that didn't have jets insisted that the jets, which had lower unit costs, have much higher prices than the propeller airplanes that remain. So I remember in coach, you got Mai Tais and wonderful meals and a piano bar in the rear and all the rest of it, but that was absolutely an artifact of regulation. And as soon as prices were deregulated, those service choices disappeared. And very importantly, historic labor contracts obscure cost differences between airline models. A truly low-cost legacy airline would be Dave Barger's crew of dedicated, inspired people, not limited by artificial union rules designed to get somebody elected in the next union election with the votes of people who don't want to work very hard, or want otherwise to have labor arrangements that are suited to them rather than to production. And those costs have been associated with the legacy model and to some extent obscure the real economics of the legacy model. So before deregulation or liberalization, we had two kinds of low-cost carriers only because of the strange legal world that Jeff was alluding to, allowed so few alternatives. In the US, you had two intrastate airlines because of a loophole in the law that said that if you flew only in one state, you weren't doing the legal definition of air transportation, and therefore your entry wasn't restricted. So in Texas and in California, you had two high-frequency, low-cost, simplified fare airlines, very close to the point-to-point model that everyone points to, pardon the pun, these days. In Europe, the only whole was IT airlines. Many of them owned or affiliated with tour operators that usually went from cold and wet parts of Europe to warm and dry parts of the world, preferably with beaches, and could sell you the seat only if you bought the package tour. So that's what we associated with low-cost carriers. I'm simplifying somewhat. Someone will have some other example. But deregulation expanded these opportunities. So there were a ton of underserved, overpriced market for the reasons I was just describing. That meant if you went in there with low fares, these markets just exploded on you. And we saw that in North America. We saw it in Australia. We've seen it in Europe, and we're seeing it now in Asia. If a market has been strangled and you come in with a low-cost alternative, many features of your model which you haven't focused on or which you've even wrongly focused on are obscured by the fact that everyone says, man, I can fly for that price. Where do I go? How do I get on this plane? Not only that, the incumbents all have costs that have been inhibited by this regime. So they are typically slow to respond and find it difficult to respond because the losses become very large. So many business models look successful initially, and everyone gets to pat themselves on the back. It's as though you found yourself in front of the goal without a goalie, kicked the ball into the net, and said to yourself, I am a great striker. So the learning process begins to occur. You have massive traffic migration as customers flock to these low fares. When that migration occurs, the legacy airlines really have no choice. They don't want to fly. There are a few suicidal attempts to fly empty planes around, but basically they end up having to price match in some form or another. They also, because of their systems, have a fair amount of premium business that they don't want to give up, so they move into price discriminatory rate structures of a kind that at least on the books were illegal under regulation, although as we know many tickets were sold under the table. But they moved to a form of pricing that was illegal under regulation and is now perfectly legal. And as those fares as these lower fares become ubiquitous, the legacy airlines fill up again, but unfortunately they don't make any money. The airplanes are fuller. So and at the same time, because there are relatively few of these markets, there are only very dense markets can support both at the same time. Frequent point-to-point LCCs plus legacy services also with full planes when everybody's free to charge the same prices. So what are the lessons? Well, this process forces legacy airlines, however painfully and however long it takes, to move their costs down, their input costs. In the US, they've done bankruptcy. They've merged, but in effect, one of the airlines has gone out of business. Airlines liquidate, making it possible to hold on to passengers at higher fares for a while, okay? More and more, though, total costs are determined by the business model and not by history. As new entrants come in and fail, the surviving new entrants discover that there aren't necessarily, after the first wonderful blush, which may last several years or even quite a number of years, there simply aren't enough markets to support full airplanes, frequent service, and rock-bottom fares. They begin to price discriminate also, and they begin to try to find ways to combine traffic flows. They begin to try to attract passengers from farther away. At their focus cities, they have self-connecting. They invent various methods. We've just heard this morning about alliance styles that in effect present passengers with the opportunity to buy two fares that are the same price that they would buy if they were alone, but they get to buy it on one document and so on. So what happens as this goes on, and of course the labor force becomes more senior, the success of the company creates resentments if people don't get raises or profit sharing. And so total costs rise for LCCs. They decline for legacies. Even in the US, they haven't converged yet. It's my prediction that they will continue to converge. They've started to converge in Europe, but that will take a very long time. And who knows what the future of Lufthansa and Air France is in an environment in which low costs continue to prevail and expand. And they find that bankruptcy is an unthinkable way to control costs. Price discrimination becomes ubiquitous. We see it now. Low-cost airlines, LCCs, almost everywhere have more than one level of fare. They unbundle the product, which is another kind of price discrimination. So if you want to check bags, or if you want a seat with a little more room, or you want to be first in line, you want to be early to board, you pay more. So these are all a form of price discrimination. None of that costs the airline more. We discover that system scope matters. If you want passengers to pay more money, you need to provide them with convenience. One form of convenience is purchase convenience. I can buy everything I need from one airline. I live in Atlanta. If I fly Delta, I can be in their frequent flyer program, which basically pays me for flying Delta and is more valuable because of all the places Delta flies. I can offer a corporate contract to corporate purchasers that will cover all their needs and reward them for loyalty. And you can substitute London for Atlanta or any place big enough to support a substantial operation with nonstops. As long as those frequent nonstops exist, you can also serve less dense markets conveniently because you get hub connections between smaller cities that will never have direct service. And you could even have 5 departures a day at one of these smaller cities, taking people at convenient times to airports they want to go to with the cost of a stop, but it's still the best deal for them. And they actually, weirdly enough, many of them, business passengers, pay a premium to do that rather than to go from someplace they don't want to go at some time they don't want to go. And ultimately, no airline offers a single cost convenience trade-off and achieves sustainable revenue. So if everybody has the same costs, and if everyone could offer the same product, doesn't mean they do, what's a low-cost airline? Well, what a low-cost airline, now it's still a state of being. Even in the United States, it has to do with company culture and all the rest of this. But over time, as this evolves, it becomes a choice of business model. It becomes a choice of which trade-off of price and convenience I want to offer. And given aircraft configurations and all the rest of it, also history and my historic position in markets and airports and so on, I probably can't choose from 100 different price convenience options. And it's easier for legacy airlines to choose one kind of option than for LCCs, and it's easier for LCCs to choose one kind of option than the other. LCCs have not been terribly successful offering luxurious transportation or even highly convenient transportation at high prices. but they have become successful offering more convenience and more comfortable accommodations than, say, Ryanair, at higher prices than Ryanair. And you can see in Europe, for example, an EasyJet and a Ryanair currently coexisting, and coexisting profitably. So the low-cost challenge is this. Given what I just said about scale, and given the pressures to keep growing, especially the pressures that capital markets provide to keep growing, airlines make very poor fixed income securities. The business is so cyclical that airline stocks are always going to be very volatile, so they need to offer the prospect of growth and high returns, even if they're not certain, in order to attract capital. So every airline reaches a critical point where market density won't support the next unit of expansion. When we get our panel up here, Dave Barger is an expert on this problem. That is, JetBlue started as a point-to-point airline and discovered you ran out of markets you could just fly point-to-point, and began to look for subtle ways to serve smaller markets. So what are the network expansion options? Well, you can construct a hub. You can construct something that's sort of like a hub, which you call a focus city, where you don't spend all the money to have all the airplanes on the ground at the same time, so you get more operations per gate, better utilization of your ground crew, but you still offer passengers pretty good connecting opportunities at lower prices. You can form an alliance. That's a way to get flow without expanding into territory that you can't serve profitably. More controversially, we have legacy airlines now in the LCC game. There was some talk this morning about whether that's offensive or defensive. When I see that all 3 new LCCs in Japan are owned by the 2 historic incumbent airlines with outside managers who know how to operate at lower costs than they do, and some outside suppliers of capital, but the control is still in the hands of the historic operator, my mind says defensive, but maybe I lack imagination. In the United States, legacy LCCs failed, also in Canada, also in Europe. Remains to be seen what happens in Asia. So the Asian market, to sum up, the Asian market resembles its predecessors in a lot of ways. It had all these historic restrictions, bilateral restrictions, political restrictions, and so on. It offers many opportunities. It's a huge underserved market. So you get in there and you get the prices down, and the passengers flock to your airline, and you're a hero. Okay? Many legacy carriers, one is inclined to say most, in Asia, have been so weakened by government protection that they really don't respond very well. And you see some of them now, evolving, trying to evolve or even combining with their LCC competition in a way that they hope will preserve some of it. And you see others presenting the kind of bill that Air India has been presenting the Indian government with regularly, that sooner or later may stop being paid. But you have weak enough competition from the legacy carriers, again, to obscure the differences or the forces that force the choice of LCC price convenience trade-off. Historically, it's a very standardized product, so you have a lot of room for experimentation. Every solution to this dilemma of how do I get 25,000 passenger hours per airline per day at a minimum and grow that airline is a compromise between convenience and cost. There's just no way to avoid that compromise. So you have to suggest, they add cost, getting higher yields, for example, getting better revenue so you can serve thinner markets where you have higher unit costs because you're either using smaller airplanes, more complex systems, or you have to pay alliance fees, or you do something. You have complexity that adds cost. They add operational risk. Alliances are as difficult in their own way as the merger of similar airlines, But some of the risks, at least as we heard, are raised to some exponential power. But the compromises are necessary, and they depend on shrewd assessment of the feasible alternatives. And with good planning, good luck, and good execution, and the passage of a lot of time, they offer revenue and they offer growth opportunities. The issue is whether you can add revenue and grow and survive growth. That may sound like a paradox, but we have seen that this is actually the critical issue that LCCs face as they converge. The critical issues for legacies are more obvious. It's how much internal destruction can they survive as they try to get their costs down to levels that will allow them to compete with LCCs. Thank you. Do I invite the panelists up, or do you? You invite. Okay, could I please see Adel Ali, Azran Osman, I hope I'm not butchering names, Neil Burrows, David Barger, and Alex Krug, who are here for your delectation and entertainment, not to mention education. Why don't we leave this seat for me in case, I think we have enough seats, sure. Right, yeah. We'll see whether my aging legs give out. Okay, so my first question, have I got this? Yes, good. My first question is for Adel Ali, and my question is, can an LCC survive and prosper without a substantial home origin market, without a lot of people in its home market buying tickets? Can I just sort of pick up an LCC and put it wherever I want?
Of course not. I guess you can't put an airline in any form or shape, or any transportation business, or any business in a place if you don't have a home market. So you've got to have, hence the old catchment area and the home market. And it's, I think probably quite a lot of recent failures in LCC, and probably some of non-LCCs we've seen, was as a result of capital available, fix an airline, spreadsheet looks very good, and then you start it up and then you realize the reality, where are the people to fly? And therefore, I totally agree that you do need a good base customer and also a good catchment area around you to have a successful airline, be it LCC or non-LCC.
Does that mean that if I want to start an LCC, I either have to find some substantial home market that for some reason is unserved, or I have to go in and be prepared to fight a war to the death with somebody who's already there?
I think that a very good example of this is, let's look at Africa. Huge area, very few airlines serving particularly Central and Western Africa. And the reason, it's thin market. Not a lot of LCCs, or not a lot of even legacy carriers around in those places, simply because the markets are small. And this business is unless you want to fly a 45-seater, a bigger airplane needs people. And as you rightly described earlier, there are certain parameters in terms of numbers for the business to be viable and sustainable. And people seem to be the driving. The only thing that one has to look at is not necessarily get to the airline data that exists if you're setting up an airline, which happens a lot, saying, well, nobody is flying in this particular area, so setting up an airline is necessarily not wrong. And if you look at the LCC throughout the world, not just in one area, what sort of stimulation they have brought to the table, probably in the last 15, 20 years that we've seen, and of course much longer before that in America. And from my personal experience, what I have seen is probably a good 70% of the people who've flown with our airline, Air Arabia, have never been on an airplane before. And now they are customers that will never fly or travel on anything before. And I think those is stimulation. And the other bit is how many other things you do in terms of making the traveling much more easier. Because if we go back an era, of look at when there wasn't LCC, certainly from our part of the world, it was very interesting that what we saw, a lot of gateways being served, but not a lot of airports being served. Today, I think, it's very normal to find, even in a regulated country, few airports are well served. And the classic one that I never forget was 8 years ago when we started, only the whole of India had 4 international airports, and today we're flying to 13 international airports in India. And I think those things that not necessarily a legacy carrier always think of.
Yes, although virgin territory is cheaper to enter than territory that's already partly occupied. And what you're saying basically is you are finding places, but you're connecting them to a home base that provides, it's not very big, but it's very rich, and it provides a substantial background. Either that, or you're telling me that actually you don't need a strong home base.
No,
One or the other. I'm trying to reconcile.
You absolutely need a strong home base. And I think probably where our base is, the main hub is very unique in the sense that it is not a very big population, but 80% of the population are expatriate, and therefore 80% of the country every year want to travel back home and come back.
Okay, anyone want to comment on this?
I think from a European perspective, which may well be different, but if it's possible to run a low-cost operation out of a home base with a small market, I only wish somebody had told me how to do it when I was trying to do it. And I was trying to run an airline out of Brussels, where there is a population of 1 million people, 10 million people in Belgium altogether, where there was a legacy carrier using the same airport, which was half owned by the state, and a very low-cost airline being encouraged by the EU at Charleroi down the road. And it's not 100 kilometers away, it's 40 kilometers away. And this is where we come into the issue of regulation, that this was deemed okay by the EU regulators. The EU that brought you the EU monetary system. You know, are we going to trust them to bring us a well-regulated European aviation industry? Not for my money, we're not. So I think in European terms, to answer the question, if you're going to have a home base, you're probably talking of something like 4 million, is what we used to reckon. And to try and do it otherwise, I think, means that you will only live for the short term.
Any other comment? Oh.
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
Sure, Mike.
You're my next victim on the next question, but come with this one.
Yeah, no, thanks. It's,
really know about.
By the way, my first airline job, Mike was president and CEO of New York Air at the time, so I'm delighted to be on the panel with you. Thank you very much, Michael. I think a strong home base is so important to the early years of the company, and JetBlue today was really the idea of People Express 2, if you remember People Express, and then Virgin USA. And neither one of them really became real. Obviously, JetBlue did, but it was because New York and Kennedy Airport really didn't, and New York didn't have low fares. People Express was gone, New York Air was gone, and so a big market, 9 million people, a catchment of 20 million, but the lack of low fares and a lot of infrastructure. And I think without that, I'm not sure that we would have been here into a second decade when I think about the early years, the foundational years of our company.
So this is the segue exactly to the question I want to ask you. So you start, and there's this huge market, and you have wonderful low fares, and we've learned together at New York Air that treating passengers nicely doesn't necessarily raise your costs, and oddly enough, they respond to civility, and so you're doing actually pretty well. But your original business plan is I'm going to get a ton of airplanes, and I'm going to fly them point to point to everywhere, to every city whose name you can remember.
Right.
And suddenly that turns out to be a lot harder than you thought. So could you describe for us a little bit, because I think your airline is one of the most interesting bits of evolution from the sort of attempt at a really pure point-to-point model to something else, including a couple of the mistakes,
sure.
as you discovered that you simply didn't have as many markets as you had airplanes coming.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, Mike. It's by the way, Mike and Jeff will probably check the history books, but at least as we look at deregulation in the United States in 1978, post-deregulation, that our company as a true startup, not as a charter and or not as a corporate airline, because there's been examples of that, such as Midwest and Spirit, but the first airline post-deregulation that's actually flown into a second decade without bankruptcy or failure or merger that took place in the first 10 years. Southwest started before the deregulation took place, although as you laid out, intrastate. And I think that early on, we always thought that as part of the founding team, large airplanes, large markets, single model, keep it simple, that's the path forward. And I think similar to not having a home base, if we would have continued along those lines, we simply would have we would have lacked the markets to really start to put 162-seat aircraft between city pairs on a point-to-point service. We're now 150 seats on the A320 model, but that led to, and I think it's interesting, your comment and your presentation, all solutions are compromises. And we had to compromise to the smaller fleet, to the Embraer 190, created its own set of challenges, more complexity. We're now in the process of diversifying even further into the partnership model, as talked about on the last panel. And so this point-to-point big airplane, point-to-point smaller airplane, there's the occasional connecting traffic within the model, the partnership traffic, and now we're starting to layer on larger aircraft. The A321 will make its way into the fleet starting next year, and in fact, a lot of people don't know that our airline, 25% of the flying is in international markets. So we had to go out and search and go find those new markets, and I'll close with this, Mike. I think this hybridization, this diversification, was so important to our first 12 years of flying, and without it, I simply think we would be in the history books, as many of the new entrant deregulation knockouts are now in the history books.
That's why I wanted you on this panel. I think this is a really important point for people who are starting out now and see the tremendous success that comes from coming in originally into a market that's been populated by zombies charging high prices, and you get a tremendous burst of success, and as I say, you pat yourself on the back, and you need to understand that a moment will come where you need to start thinking, what do I do with this so I can keep it going? I'm kind of curious, at this point, roughly what percentage of connecting passengers online or interline from partners do you have?
For our company, we're 86% point-to-point, 14%.
So you're up to 14. See, I would say you're up to 14%.
Up to 14, and even the connecting traffic, we almost with the partnerships, we really look at that as point-to-point, because we're selling, for example, Christoph Aer Lingus, right from Dublin into Kennedy, that's connecting on. It's EI to B6. So we almost look at that as really not connecting traffic, but point-to-point.
You do, but the customer doesn't.
That's correct.
That's the key. On the revenue side, the customer sees that as a convenience.
That's true.
And because if you really did nothing to facilitate it, that's where you were before.
That's correct.
You are now expending effort and some money to make it seem and be more convenient than it would have been otherwise. And you will be faced as you go on and decide you want to richen your fare mixture more. If you find that that's what you want to do, that you will need to find other ways to add convenience, I would argue.
That's true. And I think of our Boston model as a heavy business focus, so there's a lot of frequency. New York Kennedy, for those of you who have been through the New York area, that's not a preferred airport of choice for the business flyer. So it's more point-to-point or with leisure. And so on through the system. So this diversification, again, what got us here won't get us there. I mean, if our team comes forward with a business cabin, so be it, right? Because we need to continue to evolve that hybridization, even though it's compromised. But I think we have to, because to not probably means, again, that we're in the history books.
Okay, so convenience means a lot for relatively short-haul passengers because the trip isn't intended to consume a day or more of their lives. So we know where this is going, and we know who this question is going to. So I want to ask Osman, how different is it for a long-haul carrier trying to figure out what mix of price and convenience will succeed in a marketplace against legacy carriers?
There's no difference to the logic, Mike. When you look at the long-haul segment, you realize surely there's no industry or no segment where there's only one way of serving it, especially if it's a product and service proposition that is more high-end, higher cost. Surely there must be a different way of serving it towards a more price-sensitive passenger segment. And what we've been able to do is to create the model that delivers exactly that. So the same benefits that you're offering a short-haul LCC passenger, namely a much lower price point supported by a much lower unit cost to get to a destination, and immediately you see the huge surge in passengers traveling. So therefore, this is not just about there's only some number of people traveling, you're capturing market share, but you're literally creating or stimulating a new market because you've opened up access.
Tell me, is your seating configuration now the same as it was when you started?
There's a very minor difference. The reason for that was, instead of 28 premium economy seats, we went to 12 flatbed seats, was because in our part of the world, premium economy doesn't really exist. And actually what we realized is that the cost of the seats themselves are not a big difference to the overall price, especially in the full service or legacy context, right? There's a huge markup. So the ability to offer a product that is similar to what a Singapore Airlines, Thai, or Malaysia is offering, but at a dramatically lower price point, immediately generates interest. But nonetheless, it is a small part of the business. It's basically a way of saying, hey, if we had an all-economy configuration in a long-haul 400-seater type plane, even if you had 90% load factor, the number of times that you would touch that last 10% real estate on your plane is maybe a few weeks or months of the year. So you'd have dramatic underutilization of that space.
But don't you have to manage now 2 inventories?
Not really.
You mean you just let them show up, and if the 13th guy shows up, you just tell him, too bad?
It's not a complex thing. It doesn't even add complexity. Here's my challenge. If you believe what we're doing adds complexity, show me another airline in this world that has a lower unit cost.
By the way, I didn't say you're doing a bad job. You're being defensive. I think you're doing an inevitably good job in trying to figure out what it is you have to offer in the way of combinations and price and convenience to maximize the particular place in the market you've decided to occupy. But my only point, and that I'm pushing you on, obviously, is that you started out with a certain idea, and as you went and learned, you discovered there were people willing to pay more money who wouldn't fly you if you didn't offer them. And I noticed you didn't even go to a sort of sit-up business class seat. You went right to the legacy business class standard these days, the lie-flat seat. So in effect you said, I can produce an experience that has elements. I assume you don't have as fancy meal service as they do, but I can produce an experience that has elements of what they offer at an increase in cost and complexity that creates a large value cost spread for you. That is small cost, large value. You've noticed that the plane isn't 100% full all the time, so it seems worth doing. Now the next question will come as your costs rise over time, which unless you violate international conventions on slavery, they will. So as your costs rise, you may discover you're going to look for more opportunities to charge some people more for what you regard as cost-effective ways to serve their convenience. That's a prediction.
I would challenge that because I don't think, unlike others, you will see our cost structure rise. The only factor that has pushed costs up has been fuel price. Strip that out, the costs have still been dramatically low.
You think you can find people willing to work at intake wages for their entire
There's
career?
a lot more to it. I mean, there's a lot more that goes into the model besides wages. But the key thing here is that in any industry, not just the airline industry, what starts off as a pure price commodity, eventually, people start to find ways of delivering a high quality product, and that becomes the commodity, right? So, for example, what used to be offered in the first generation iPod or smartphone today is being offered, those same functionalities are being offered in the mass market brands. So the higher brands then have to evolve and create high levels of products and services, right? So the key is, in this industry, is you've got people like us who are commoditizing a higher level service and product quality at a much lower cost. And that puts pressure on the other players who now have to figure out, wow, either you keep moving up the value chain, or if you're going to still try to compete at a higher cost structure, you better hope you're in Air India.
So I have a question. We're probably not finished with this, but I think it's a good start, and I think you've made a good statement. Alex, I want to turn to you, because I'm curious. Do you think a hub can support both a legacy and a low-cost carrier? It seems to me you've run this experiment, and I'd be interested in your views.
Yeah, we've run a couple of different experiments. I was taken aback by your quasi-hub description. It probably defines us better, even though I don't like quasi as a word. We have got such a large volume of destinations, nearly 80 direct destinations from our home airport, Barcelona. And we have such a large number of destination cities with 5 or more daily frequencies that you basically have a hub defined. Mm-hmm. So the only thing that we've done, we did this in June of 2010, was to turn on the ability to sell ONDs via Barcelona with a minimum connecting time. We started with 90 minutes and we've taken it down to 55 now. And it's just really successful. So this year we are aiming to carry slightly over 2 million passengers out of a total network 16 million. So, and it's our third year. It's all Vueling to Vueling. We're beginning to do a few connections with others. Now, is that a hub like my American Airlines Dallas-Fort Worth hub when I started working in this industry, where we had 11 waves of flights? No, it's not.
Well, it's a hub in the sense that it allows you to serve city pairs that won't support frequent nonstop service, both on a nonstop basis from the hub, in quotes, yep, city, and on a one-stop basis, many city pairs that would never support service. Yep. But that's at Barcelona, where you are, yep, the big gorilla. Yep. So tell me about Madrid.
Madrid, it really was an experiment. We were asked by our shareholder Iberia if we would be interested on running some flights for them last year, the equivalent of 5 aircraft to 8 or 9 destinations. And of course they gave us, well, actually it was quite an interesting experiment because they told us you're going to need 7 airplanes. And we said, why? And I said, well, these are the flights you got to fly. And we looked at them, and after a few days of negotiating 5 minutes up and down, we took it down to 5 aircraft, which did not have as much utilization as the airplanes in Barcelona, but it was still not bad utilization. It was above 9 hours a day. The purpose for us was obviously to try to prove that we could make money, and second, to get a certificate from Iberia that said you are certified to be able to fly and to feed a hub. And we have achieved it. We have told the markets that it has been a cash positive operation in Madrid last year. It actually finished a couple of weeks ago. We had very little operation this year, just a couple of flights to 3 destinations, but the bulk was last summer. Very high punctuality, all the standard customer service levels, baggage lost, complaints, etc., were at the same level as point-to-point or below the level. We put a lot of emphasis on making sure that the operation went smoothly. It was slightly more expensive because there's a few things that we did because we were afraid that it could go wrong. We didn't really want it to go wrong. But all in all, it was a positive cash and positive EBIT contributing experience. Iberia has decided to create their own carrier. That's fine with us. We have a lot of Europe to explore.
When you say you have a lot of Europe to explore, would you imagine that you would attempt to set up some other place where you would provide connecting opportunities, or are you just talking about adding destinations from places where you already have substantial scale? You can see why I'm asking, because I'm going to ask you about the economics at the other end of those.
Of course. We certainly would not change our flight schedules as we are right now to be able to feed other people. In fact, there are a lot of people that come to us in Amsterdam, in Milan, and in other destinations asking us to see if, one, if we could feed them, second, if we could just change the flight times a couple of hours, to which we won't do that. That doesn't make sense to us because we are looking for efficiency in our origin points. But a couple of statistics for you. This year, 50% of our traffic will originate outside of Spain. We expect that percentage is going to continue growing over the coming years. We're not in the best of economies, so we have to look for a way to grow that. But we now have more than 10 routes that don't touch Spain. We have 3 daily flights, Paris-Rome, 2 daily flights, Paris-Zurich. We have some domestic France flights. That's going to continue.
How do you market in those markets? You don't have enough seats to amortize marketing costs.
Well, the funnier part is if you look at our marketing costs, unit costs, they tend to be quite low. Both Rome and Paris have been cities served by Vueling since very early on, nearly more than 6.5 years. And a tremendous amount of money was spent 6-7 years ago in brand awareness. And since then, even though we have downsized the amount of marketing spent, we have been doing more guerrilla style social media and other kind of very targeted online marketing. That works well for the leisure VFR markets, but the fact that we have come in fairly strong on GDSs, on corporate contracts, Charles & Wagon Lease, American Expresses, etc., has also given us a presence on the indirect traffic, on direct sales, and that also has given us exposure.
Why would someone sign a corporate contract with an airline that has only 3 flights a day between Paris and Milan?
Because they're a subsidiary of a Spanish company.
Pardon me?
Because they're a subsidiary of a Spanish company. It all starts there. So it's very unlikely that a French company based in Paris will sign a corporate contract with us.
That's another set of marketing costs that's covered elsewhere, basically.
Sure. But we will, of course, be exploring every opportunity that we can to make sure the planes are going full. But we're going in that direction for sure. We're looking for the next Barcelona.
It will be interesting to see. Now, at least, I'm not sure about AirAsia X or Air Arabia, but at least 3 of you have operated at airports that most people would regard as expensive and attempted to operate on a low-cost basis. And I'm curious to know what you're sitting there with legacy carriers who have contracts with the airport authority and who will object if the airport authority does a deal for you on cheaper terms and they will do it for someone else. So what do you do to manage your ground costs at an airport that is dominated by legacy carriers? And I'll take them in any order. Alex, you want to start?
It's tricky. Look, it is true. We've been in situations in which we've been really, really, really close to signing a deal to base multiple aircraft at a major so-called expensive or mainline airport. And at the last minute, sufficient lobby has been made by the national carrier to disrupt entirely the conditions that we were going to sign for. So we're very familiar with that example. At the end, most of these airports for us are in stronger economies than Spain, which allow us to charge a slightly higher premium on the fares, and we can get away with it. But remember, it's the whole package, just like Astronaut was saying.
So that's a kind of trade-off, more convenience, more cost, but higher revenue because you're getting to use the preferred airport.
More cost to the passenger, which of course the passenger recognizes
more
that airport.
More cost to you, passed along as higher fares to the passenger, which the passenger is willing to pay because it's more convenient to use that airport than fake Munich or fake Brussels. Sure. David?
Sure. By the way, at Kennedy Airport, and I think most people would think of it as a high-cost airport, but our average employment cost is high single digits in terms of dollars, right? So it's not the mid-teens or the $20 per employment type of cost. Now, granted, it was higher before we started to add in service, but I think really what's happened with our relationship, and I'll just take New York, Mike, at Kennedy, LaGuardia, we're in Newark, we're in a couple of the satellite airports too, in White Plains and in Stuart Newburgh. But Kennedy alone, when we first started flying in the year 2000, and about 32 million people were using JFK Airport, all airlines, in and out, enplanements, deplanements, and now the number's at 50 million. And so the stimulation that we've put into place, that others have also added to that as well, other airlines, I think the Port Authority, well, they definitely recognize that. And I think how we then manifested that is Port Authority financing at very attractive rates to build our terminal. And so our model was a little bit different in terms of the rates and charges. As long as we put equipment in, we were seeing a reduction in the average enplanement cost. But really, the Port Authority financing for the better part of our Terminal 5 airport, it's close to $1 billion of financing over 30 years. So it worked out quite well.
That was after you had built up enough muscle and had shown them how profitable you were for them. What did you do early on as you tried to figure out how to manage costs in an LCC model at a place that wasn't really designed for LCCs?
Yeah, I think it's early on, it's probably what a lot of us do. It's the A320 is the only aircraft, kept it simple aircraft. We were 12 and a half, 13 hours a day, so heavy aircraft utilization. We were doing it with our own people upstairs and downstairs, unless we were in a small outstation, and obviously, but I think very productive. I mean, you get the benefits of young labor costs.
So the utilization was giving you departures per gate?
Utilization per gate, of course, it depended on, interesting, I heard in your presentation up to 10 departures per day, and in the New York airspace, you just can't get that, right, because of the complexity of the air traffic up there. Early days, we were seeing 6 departures. We're probably about 8. And so we were using the gate a lot by New York standards, but we really couldn't get much above 8 predictably because of the air traffic control constraints. But I think the early days, relatively easy. It's, but it's, we also started with a pretty significant nest egg. I mean, it was the most well-funded startup in U.S. aviation history at the time at $130 million U.S. And not that we were looking at that as it's okay to go spend it. I think the DNA of just being productive had to be in place, and it's still there today. And if we lose sight of our cost structure, we're not an LCC, we're certainly not network, but we're just above the true LCCs in the United States. If we lose sight of that, again, this airline won't exist.
Neil, did you have this problem at Brussels?
We had the problem in spades in that not only did the Airport Authority charge different rates, they charged a higher rate to the low-cost carrier than they did to the national carrier, the legacy carrier, because there was a government shareholding in the airport as well as in the national airline. So that made it particularly difficult. And it's a great shame that our majority shareholder, before he bought the airline, hadn't recognized this. It's something that Richard Branson came to live to regret, that he had started a low-cost airline in a completely inappropriate destination. How did we cope with it? Well, the long and the short of it is that we didn't. Mm-hmm. We didn't survive. And all we could do in the meantime, of course, was to minimize our costs in other areas, to improve our productivity, which we tried to do by adding charter onto the low-cost element of the model. So we were getting very high utilizations. And this enabled us to sort of get near to break even. Occasionally we got over it, and sometimes we made a loss. But there was never going to be any long-term future, no matter how efficient you got, in such a small market with so many competitors, some of whom were subsidized.
Now, I assume Adel and Azran have solved this different ways. That is, you're part of a Azran, you're part of a big group, and Adel, you are, I assume, the big player in Bahrain. Is that correct?
Well, no, we are in UAE in Sharjah, but I think we've got the good story and the bad side of it. The good side of it is, of course, from Morocco, where we have a hub. We fly into Europe to quite a few secondary airports, and that's good. Some of them, want you to be there. However, from the Sharjah hub or the Egypt hub, it's a very different story. but actually it's cheaper to go to the main airports than going to secondary airports. Most of these countries are regulated. The national carriers seem to own, run, handle the airports, and they tend to not want you to go to secondary airports because you basically take what's so-called their domestic right business. As a result, they tend to have a much higher, you pay more, up to 50, 60% more to go to an empty airport than operating into a very busy airport.
Well, for many places, it's a way to protect their national carriers, not to let you go to a place where it might be cheaper. I mean, many years ago, back in semi-prehistoric times, say 20 years ago, we were interested in Orly and in transatlantic service to Orly, which was technically possible, and which one or two airlines were actually doing. But when you approached ADP, sorry, which owned both of them, and you would have thought would have been indifferent between them, it became clear that to the extent that they thought that you would be worse competition for Air France if you went into Orly, they were not inclined to encourage you to do that.
The good news, though, because of those circumstances, you're killing a good 8 to 10 hours time journey for the customer by operating those airports. Therefore, the customers are willing to pay more to fly to those places. Hence, it compensates for those hefty charges which are there.
Thank you for reinforcing my presentation. That's exactly my point. You're trading with the passenger, making a different deal for cost and convenience than an original deal or another deal that you might have made somewhere else. And you know, that is an important theme of this discussion. Every time you offer a passenger a flight at a certain time with certain characteristics, some optional, some required, you're basically making a cost-convenience deal with the passenger. You're shaking your head, Osman, but you are, whether you know it or not, as long as the customer has an alternative.
Well, I just wanted to add that, you know, we operate into quite a lot of expensive airports, Haneda, Sydney, for example. And the key is...
I was wrong, sorry.
The airport rates may be high and may be the same, but that doesn't mean that the per passenger costs are the same, right? We believe every time we need to have at least a 50% cost advantage, even in terms of airport and ground handling costs per passenger. For example, parking, there's a big difference because we put our planes there a much shorter time. Even landing charges, because when you land with a 377-seater plane, very different from a 285-seater plane, same size, same tonnage. Ground handling costs, again, right? The number of resources that you need, especially in our model, especially with a high percentage of self-check-in passengers, makes a big difference. So even though you go into a high-cost airport, you still have a significant cost advantage relative to the legacy carriers. And the other big advantage that the high-cost airports provide is cargo. For a wide-body plane, the relative revenue from cargo, which is no additional cost to the passenger, more than offsets usually the delta in high airport costs.
I think at this point I'd like to open this discussion up to the audience. We've seen we have enough issues. We're not discussing the last question because I would rather spend the time on the basic trade-offs. It was also written, and it's probably an important point to make, it's written without my giving it the world enough thought. Now, these days, there are enough ways to buy systems that you have a choice without installing a system of your very own to get support systems, but you still do have to adapt to it. And if anyone wants to raise or discuss that point.
It's a pretty easy answer to that last question.
Pardon me?
The answer to the last question is pretty easy, it's no.
Okay. Anyone? Basically, you should stay.
I don't think anybody in this audience or in this world could argue any other answer than no. If an airline, which is related to another airline, and the second one is a legacy airline, wants to survive, you should try to use the least amount of practices from the legacy airline,
Well,
including systems.
then in that case, let's spend a moment on this. Yeah, because,
I got you back.
And I am not a fan of legacy airline systems. Believe me, I was in charge of IT at Northwest, and I understand what a swamp that is and how difficult it is to return from that swamp alive. So, I'm not selling it. But when you find at the point in your evolution that you are more interested in getting what I'm going to call convenience customers who are willing to pay higher prices than you're accustomed to charging, you may discover that some of the features of legacy systems, customer tracking, of seat assignment, of loyalty accumulation, all those kinds of things have real value.
It's a myth.
Pardon me?
It's a myth,
What's the myth?
what you're saying.
It's not the first time in my life I've been wrong, but I'm not ready to admit it yet.
Look, let me run you through a traditional airline experience. You buy a business class seat, you get miles that you can use to travel around the world. I don't know, you get a newspaper maybe, or you get a snack or a drink. What else do you get? You get priority boarding, check-in, or do you get the middle seat blocked?
Sorry, I understand.
But let me finish. This is
But you're using system differently you're answering it. I'm happy to let you say what you want. Go ahead. But I'll explain my question afterwards.
So I'm describing a traditional airline experience, which you would have when you buy a traditional airline ticket using the traditional airline systems, and you get managed in terms of customer data and intelligence, etc. Well, that's Vueling today. Everything I described, we do. All that experience is available to you through any travel agency in any Vueling flight, and that's not achieved using traditional airline systems.
How do you do the seat assignment, customer experience tracking, frequent flyer program tracking in an integrated way? Did you buy someone else's system or develop your own?
We have we use a shell of a reservation system provider, and then we've built a lot of stuff on top of it.
And the reservation system provider was or wasn't connected to a legacy airline?
It was not connected to any legacy airline.
Okay, that was the reason why I took the question off the list, was because I understood, with some thought, I understood you could buy, in effect, legacy capability without going to the legacy airline and getting the system.
That would be you.
Well,
No?
Thank you, Alex. That would be us, I guess. Of course, we started in the Navitaire system and with the Open Skies, and we did not go down the pathway to the New Skies. And I know that Navitaire is represented here today. We made the decision to go into the Sabre system, but we made that decision because the only way that we could really optimize the partnership traffic for us, we believed, was through something that was more, again, I don't like the term legacy either, but something that was more network friendly, if you will, with partnerships. And Mercator's here as well, assisting us. So we went down a different path. And again, because we were migrating into these partnerships, 16 today, and who knows, 30 in the next couple of years.
And I should have asked you, and thank you, Alex, for reminding me that I'd forgotten that these guys had migrated that you had at JetBlue migrated from one system to another. And obviously, your explanation of the migration makes me feel better, because Alex had convinced me I was an idiot.
No, and I was aware of when I was saying that Dave was here. And by the way, I should tell you, Dave was a board member of Vueling, and there is a JetBlue blood still in Vueling. I should tell you, if not, I'm carrying it.
No, I appreciate it. Thank you.
We are interested in partnerships with other airlines. We had 4 last summer, and we will sign some others. But we're taking it slower, and probably the speed of adoption of partnerships with other airlines is matching the sophistication of the reservation provider as time goes by. This is a world that we want to venture in, but we want to go very slowly.
Do you think that at some point you may do what JetBlue did and migrate onto the shell, something which is the shell of a legacy system?
I don't know. My only concern is CASM. if we can maintain. At this moment, we're not particularly encouraged to have to do it. If we reach the point and we absolutely had no option to do it and we could maintain CASM, then we would. It's a cost issue for us.
Okay, from the audience,
Sorry. No, I got right there. You guys
please, would you stand up and tell us who you are?
I'm Rigas Staganis.
I remember you.
Azan said that he challenged anybody to match the AirAsia X seat mile costs. If that is the case, why has AirAsia pulled out of its long-haul services to Europe? Is it because they were losing money, or was it because it was the price they had to pay to join up with Malaysian Airlines? And if it's the latter, was Malaysian Airlines losing money and is losing money on its long-haul operations?
I think that question is direct to you.
I think so. I can definitely tell you it has nothing to do with the latter, because those guys are so preoccupied with their internal strife that we've not even had a meaningful conversation. Here's a little statistic. So what happens if even an airline like Singapore Airlines loses money in Europe right now, as reported by the Singapore Business Review in March? Does that mean the entire full-service long-haul model is also irrelevant? No, it means Europe has got some structural problems. That's the reason why we pull out. It's not about the model, it's not about the distance. It is Europe.
Is it your argument that nobody's making money flying to and from Europe?
I'm just saying, even if in an airline like Singapore Airlines can't make money, do you generalize to say the entire full service?
Well, no, I'm just curious. Are you saying that no one is making money flying from Southeast Asia to Europe right now?
Right now, I'd be very surprised if anyone was.
Do you think you were losing less money than they are?
Probably, but we're not in the business of losing money. So if there's a market that has a bigger growth potential, redeploy.
Might I just ask,
Absolutely.
Does sector length have a relevance here?
Not really.
On the long haul?
Nope.
I mean...
Well, what will have a relevance is when you start using 4 engines instead of 2.
Yeah.
Because then you're burning 2,200 gallons instead of 1,800 gallons. But other than that, we're pulling out of Delhi, Mumbai, which are some of our shorter sector lengths as well.
I just wonder because generally in the low-cost model, the more short sectors you can get, the more rotations you can get, the more profits you're going to make. And I just wondered if you see a similar sort of equation applying in the long-haul market.
What matters more than issues like sector length is the supply and demand balance in markets. That has a much greater impact on route profitability. Things like having the highest relative market share has a much higher impact on profitability than sector length. So there are a lot more other critical variables than the pure distance, right? I'd much rather fly a 10-hour flight where we're the dominant airline than a short 4-hour flight where we're number 4.
Follow up, Regis?
I'd just like to follow up. I think Azan very cleverly, instead of admitting that they were making losses, said the Singapore Airlines are making losses into Europe. I think actually what he's saying is that they were losing a lot of money in Europe. He puts the blame on the market, not on the management or the model. And so my question is, why couldn't they adjust the model to make sure that they were profitable in this market? They were charging substantially lower fares than everybody else. And one of the answers we get is because they didn't have a sufficient market share. Well, then the question is, can you ever get a sufficient market share in long-haul operations?
Again, while you could, but if you've got a better alternative, right, there's an opportunity cost that you're missing. So we know the model is very profitable in markets where we've got many more routes, higher frequency. So when we're given the opportunity to fly to Sydney, grab that instead, right? So put more resources in China and Australia and North Asia instead of Europe. Just because, Europe is Europe doesn't mean you have to make it work. right? Why crack your head on a market that is going down when there's Asia, which has double the growth rate?
Other questions? Yes, over here. Please stand up and tell us who you are.
Okay, this is Emre. I asked a couple of questions this morning. But just on that interesting point and bringing technology into it, distribution. And now you have Google, you have Facebook, we've seen the impact of Expedia, Travelocity in dynamic packaging. The customers are getting very savvy. For instance, when I travel to Asia, I rarely think the end destination. What I often think, what is the cheapest flight I could get to somewhere, and then I took a low-cost flight. So do you see opportunity for low-cost carriers to be more represented in the social world, social media world, and take advantage of synergies, and maybe then the customers, rather than taking a long-haul flight, like 10 hours with a low-cost carrier, they do that with a specialist that does best, but then they combine the long-haul, short-haul leg.
Did you have a particular victim in mind for that question?
Oh, I think I let you to choose.
Anyone want to?
Going on the social network and putting your prices is obviously, if you're not there, something is wrong. But so far, in terms of trying to compete with long haul, particularly what I've seen, you're talking about back-end cabin. And the economy prices between Europe, East, Far East, or Far East to Middle East, or Middle East to Europe, they're relatively low. So once you combine those things to really take it away from the legacy carrier, you're competing for nothing, in my opinion. And hence, I'm not sure on certain routes. Australia to UK. I'm not, if you take the premium, if there is a premium out, the back end is pretty low. And therefore, no matter how many stops you offer, whatever you offer, you'll never break even with it, unless you got 170% seat factor. It's just pointless doing it.
This is working, yeah. So yeah, that's exactly. I think what we are going with that is that also we heard this morning a good comment around land, for instance, is a successful model in Latin America. And then also what you are doing, you are replicating a successful franchise across, but the model is not necessarily connecting them. So the point I was trying to allude is that through use of technology, through new opportunities, it's a specialization. Low cost is specialized in certain type of operation, do that well, and then let the technology and they let the customer make the choice, taking long-haul flights with premium carriers, and then combine the trip to get a good fare and a right trade-off in convenience.
I think if you've got your own various hubs, or what, and that you're getting point to point 60, 70, 80% of your business, and your long haul is complementary, it's fine. But to do a long haul one, in my opinion, it's very tough, unless you've got a lucrative market with a lucrative yield. The demand exceeds the supply, which at the moment in a lot of places they are not. Probably in Southeast Asia and China it could be the case. But in the rest of the world it doesn't seem to be the case. But what we do, of course we do, quite a lot of people connect over Egypt hub onto Morocco, into Turkey and so on. But those are a very small percentage of our total point-to-point business.
Sure, if I may, Mike, the way I interpret your question is as follows, at least in how we're looking at the world, and that is, it's really the topic of this panel, the hybridization. We had to continue to change, and so at least from our perspective, and again, we're a young company, we're just now into our 13th year of flying, but we were 100% distribution through our website, selfishly. That was the model that we wanted, but we knew it wasn't going to scale. And so as we added in the second fleet type, and now a variant of the 320 program, and now partnership, as we made the way into a network or a legacy type of environment with Sabre. So not just for partnership purposes, but it was very important to be displayed in the GDSs for us. It was imperative. And as we're in the OTAs as well today, by the way, I think we're there really for just eyeballs and advertising as opposed to is it meaningful for us to the bottom line, because we'd rather that same customer come to the website. I'm not saying anything that the OTAs don't know. And, but looking for this continued hybridization, because of the compromises, right? I mean, all these solutions are compromises to the original business plan. If we would have stayed with our original plan with distribution, there's no way that we'd be relevant to a large part of the customers that we're carrying today. I'll close with this. In Boston, we're now 100 trips a day, and 30+% of our customers are core business users who used to be on corporate programs with other airlines. We would have never been able to penetrate those companies unless we were in the GDSs. So we had to morph.
Anyone else?
No, I was going to say that for us, from a distribution perspective, it's about choice, as you were saying. So you must be present in all the channels where people want to book, including in Facebook. We have the booking engine in Facebook and on social media. I was just going to tell you the funny story I always tend to tell. I remember when the marketing director came over 2.5 years ago and said we must really begin to take our presence in Facebook seriously. So we must invest all this money, and to which, of course, they got the standard Alex response, which is, where is the ROI? How much is it going to cost? Well, this is not about cost. That we have to look at our presence and our brand awareness and our position. And I said, go back and come back with an ROI. Today, we're measuring Facebook fan euros per Facebook fan on a weekly basis. And investment in Facebook, we do the same thing in the other channels, is based on our performance. Now that measurement may be, is not 100% correct, but it's definitely at least 75% correct. It allows us to measure how we grow in distributing and or investing in these channels.
So I have a question for the person who seems to be most deeply committed to his business model. And I'm wondering, what would it take to make you rethink the business model at AirAsia X? In other words, if you lose money, do you rethink the business? Or do you think, I just need to tweak this a little bit?
If we lose money?
If you operate at a loss, in a way I'm following up on Regis's question,
sure,
but I mean it more broadly than do you raise your price or something like that. If you were repeatedly experiencing unprofitable performance in a set of markets, there are two things you could do. You could get out of the markets unless there were no markets left you could be in, or you could say, well, if I changed my business model a little bit, I'm not talking about becoming Malaysian. If I change my business model a little bit, and you've already changed it at least a tiny bit, we've agreed, when you put those flatbed seats in the plane, I could do better. What I'm interested in is your thought process, because you seem so deeply committed to the idea that if you just have the lowest possible unit costs, that's what it will take to succeed. Whereas I think that having the lowest possible unit cost for what you are producing works better, meaning that you can think about changing what you produce, but you want to produce that at the lowest possible cost.
Can I build on that? Because
sure,
the way I look at it is, in any industry, there's a spectrum of people with different business models, but ultimately, the successful business models are the ones that are clearest on the ends, right? Either you are a true priced and cost leader, and you have a strong brand that reflects that, right? For example, in retail, the Walmarts, the McDonald's, the Zara's and Uniqlo's, or the high ends, right? Whether it's the Singapore Airlines, the Porsches, the Mercedes-Benz, where you may have a higher cost structure, but you've got a premium product and service quality and a brand that goes with it that allows you to capture that price premium. The problem is going to be if you're stuck in the middle, right? Because you don't have the same kind of quality to command the price premium you need to compete with the guys on this end, but you don't have the cost structure to compete with the guys on the other end. So for me, it is the relative position. I must be on an end. If I'm stuck in the middle and you're sandwiched, that's when I think you're in a really vulnerable position. So unless there comes a time when there is another business model that has an even lower unit cost, right? And having a service proposition that allows them to outcompete us and that enforces us to be in the middle, because the middle is the vulnerable position. That's why I don't believe in this.
So Alex and Dave are out of business.
Ultimately, they will be if they stay in that position. If they're flanked on both ends, they will be.
And Target stores doesn't exist, and Hyundai doesn't exist, and so on.
Well, then you get into the execution of it, as I say. I mean, there are people who do exactly what Ryanair does and still go bankrupt. So it's not necessarily the model per se, right? It is the market leadership position, but in a business model.
But I just gave you examples of tweeners who are doing just fine.
Well.
Go ahead, Alex.
I must support Azran, and we share this, we've talked about this over the years. Everything I told you before about this premium experience I described is based on Europe's second lowest cost structure. And that comes first. So we managed to add free newspapers 2 weeks ago, but we added free newspapers at zero cost to us, including the cost of the fuel associated with the extra weight of the newspapers. So what comes first in environments such as Azran and ourselves? My particular environment is a very weak economy, high competition. We saw that on the slides before. The only way we can survive is by having very, very low cost. But I'll go farther. If we were to modify our model, as you were saying before, by having a cost structure that may adjust to the conditions of the market, which may be higher fares, there is no way back. It's very, very difficult to bring down the cost. So the real trick is to have that very, very, very low cost and find ways, however difficult that may be, mostly through technology and innovation, to deliver a product which is the same as a traditional
So
airline.
you won't serve any city per market that has, because of lower traffic density, for example, higher unit costs than the lowest unit cost market you have?
Our decisions are made from a network perspective, as you can imagine. So don't take me to an individual route. We'll judge every individual route, by the way, every new one has its business case. And it has to stand on its own. Sometimes it doesn't.
But wouldn't your decision on product also be made on a network basis? So, for example, it's like Azran's lie flat seats. You have an airplane. It has space in it, which has relatively low opportunity cost. You can sell it at higher prices. It raises your unit cost if you actually wanted to talk about ASMs, because the simple arithmetic is against you, but you do it because you make money. Now, I've been using the word compromise. Everybody, I can see that there are several of you whose guts recoil at this word. But in effect, maybe you like trade-off better, I don't know. But in effect, what I hear you saying is, if it will make more money for the business, I'm not obsessed with the arithmetic of the particular decision standing on its own, as opposed to in the context of the business.
Yes, it sounds very theoretically correct, yes.
Sounds nicer that way. David?
Yeah, I was just going to say, Mike, it's a declaration, I guess. We're a tweener. And there's just no doubt about it. We're not a network legacy airline, by the way, in the United States. They have all gone through the bankruptcy car wash, or they're in the process of going through it. So we know that we're going to have to maintain the cost structure relevance. Although I agree with your charts, over time there's going to be this convergence. And we're not the lowest cost provider. We're not Spirit, right? We're not Allegiant in the United States. We're a little bit higher than Southwest. But we think that really at the end of the day, for us and where we're attempting to fly, that is the right long-term proposition, as opposed to being the true discounter or all of a sudden to try to follow these network guys. And so we're going to have to see a couple conferences from now, Peter, who's successful right into the, as we look at flying through our second decade. But we do think that there's space for the Target stores, the enterprise car rentals. And there's a lot of examples of really valuable businesses that are in the middle, if you will, but they're not on the end. So it's a little bit different point of view that we have, but a lot of it's at looking at the history books of the United States. Again, on the earlier panel, this industry in the United States hasn't been profitable over its 98 years. We want to do things differently.
Good. Peter, would you like the last question or the last word? That seems to be the tradition.
A long-established tradition since this morning, Thank you, Mike. Yeah, well, I think what's interesting there is we have obviously got quite a divergence, and I wonder to what extent, and this is just sort of shooting from the shoulder, but to what extent that Dave's position would be different from Azran's, say, or from Alex's, as a factor of just the potential and the growth rates in those markets. Does that make a difference to, first of all, to the margin of risk that you have, that you've got a whole lot more upside, you can make mistakes, you can experiment more? Do you have to be more cautious in your markets? Are there some reasons why you should have different positions, in other words?
Can I just, I think the difference, if I can take a stab at that, is that Dave may think he's a tweener, but he's not, because the guys who have got the higher cost structure, in fact, don't have a higher product quality. It's the US legacy carriers. So his price and cost trade-off puts him at a premium end. It would be a very different market if he had Singapore Airlines based in Kennedy Airport and having that product quality.
Sure.
Let's see where he is then.
No, I agree, and I was going to say, no, thank you. It's, I'm glad maybe Singapore is not based at JFK. Great product. There's, Peter, the way that we're looking at the world now in this chapter is this diversification of our revenue base, right? This earnings, quality earnings, right? Profitable growth, quality earnings over invested capital, and driving a double-digit return on invested capital. And if we don't, and again, we're young relative to these others who are out there talking about 10% return on invested capital, whether it's Alaska Airlines or whether it's through the bankruptcy process, we're not going to attract quality investors. So that's what has us focused. It's the competitive landscape, but it's mainly internally. If we don't diversify and drive an ROIC that's going to attract capital, JetBlue's not going to be here into the third decade.
Anybody else? Well, thank you. You guys have been a fabulous panel, and I hope I haven't beat you up too much, but I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Professor.
Let's give them a hand.
Thank you.
Yes.
Absolute pleasure. Pleasure.
.4:30, please. Please come back at 4:30 sharp. Thank you.